$36 trillion. That is what the United States owes, right now, today. A number so large that if you spent $1 million every single day since the birth of Christ, you still wouldn't have spent it all. A number growing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. A number that the people responsible for it will not seriously discuss, cannot politically afford to address, and have collectively decided is somebody else's problem. And that is just one country. Add the rest of the world, and global debt sits at $315 trillion. 3 times the value of everything every human being on Earth produces in an entire year. The largest mountain of borrowed money in the history of civilization. Built over decades, accelerating right now, and sitting underneath a global economy that is simultaneously dealing with a property collapse in China, a banking system under quiet stress in America, a military conflict one miscalculation away from sending oil prices to levels not seen since the 1970s, and a political leadership class across virtually every major economy that has made a conscious, deliberate, self-preserving decision to look directly at all of this and tell you everything is fine. It is not fine. What is building right now is not a recession, not a correction. It is the kind of cascading systemic failure that restructures the global economy for a generation. And the people with the power to do something about it have made the calculation that the political cost of telling you the truth is higher than the cost of letting it become someone else's crisis. This is that story. To understand why this moment is uniquely dangerous, you need to understand what changed in 2022. For 15 years after the 2008 crisis, the world's central banks held interest rates near zero. Borrowing was essentially free. Governments borrowed more, corporations borrowed more, and the whole structure held together not because it was sound, but because the cost of carrying it was artificially suppressed. Then, inflation arrived, and the medicine that treated 2008 became the poison of 2022. The Federal Reserve raised rates from near zero to over 5% in 18 months, the fastest tightening cycle in 40 years. The European Central Bank moved from negative rates to above 4%, and $315 trillion of debt, structured around the assumption of permanent cheap money, suddenly had to be refinanced at dramatically higher costs. The consequences landed immediately. U.S. annual interest payments on the national debt crossed $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Every year, just in interest. More than the Pentagon, more than Medicaid. The single largest line item in the federal budget is now simply the price of being this indebted. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, 20 cents of every dollar the U.S. government collects disappears into interest payments before a single service is funded, before a single road is built, before a single soldier is paid. And America is not the worst case. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio sits above 250%, Italy above 140, France above 110. These are not peripheral economies. These are the structural pillars of the Western financial system, all simultaneously, right now, more indebted than at any point in their peacetime histories. The leaders of every one of these countries know this. They receive the briefings. Their finance ministers see the projections. The response, uniformly, has been to project confidence, issue carefully worded statements about long-term fiscal responsibility, and ensure the reckoning lands on the next person's desk. Because the leader who tells voters that living standards must contract to address the debt loses the next election. The leader who borrows more to keep everyone comfortable wins it. The political incentive structure of modern democracy is almost perfectly designed to make this problem worse until it becomes a crisis. Now add the match that could light all of it simultaneously. Iran. The U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure has escalated well beyond the shadow warfare of the previous decade. Strikes on Iranian soil, retaliatory operations, proxy networks activated across the region. And sitting in the geographic center of all of it, almost entirely ignored in the economic conversation, is a stretch of water that should be making every finance minister on Earth lose sleep. The Strait of Hormuz. 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through those 21 miles flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply every single day. 17 million barrels. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq. Every major Gulf producer depends on that strait. There is no alternative route at scale. It is the single most critical physical vulnerability in the entire global economy. One choke point, 1/5 of the world's oil. 21 miles. Iran controls the northern coastline, and Tehran has spent decades building the asymmetric capability designed precisely for this scenario. fast attack boat swarms, anti-ship ballistic missiles, underwater mines that cost almost nothing to deploy and a fortune to sweep. The Houthis in Yemen have already demonstrated that Iranian-supplied drones and missiles can disrupt major global shipping lanes for months. The model works. Everyone knows it works. Any serious disruption of that strait sends oil toward levels not seen since the 1970s energy crisis. Analysts have modeled scenarios where sustained disruption pushes Brent crude above $150 a barrel. At $150 oil, the cascade is fast and brutal. Inflation re-accelerates violently. Central banks preparing to cut rates are forced to hold or raise. Debt servicing costs for governments already at their limits spike further. Consumer spending collapses, and the banking system stress, sitting just below the surface, tips from manageable to catastrophic. The people making decisions about Iran are not making them in a room where economic consequences receive serious weight. Benjamin Netanyahu is managing a coalition whose survival depends on partners who prefer escalation over restraint. Donald Trump is operating from a framework where projecting maximum strength is both political brand and genuine philosophy, regardless of second-order consequences. The leaders of Europe, who would absorb a savage oil price spike into already fragile economies, are watching with essentially no seat at the table. The people bearing the consequences are not the people making the decisions. That gap is where disasters are born. While the Middle East provides the potential trigger, China is the slow-motion collapse already underway. Xi Jinping has built his entire political identity around the narrative of Chinese inevitability. The idea that China's rise to global primacy is not a question of whether, but when. It is a compelling narrative, and it is colliding right now with structural economic realities that the narrative cannot honestly address. The Chinese property sector collapse is the largest single asset price implosion in recorded economic history. Property and related industries represented roughly 30% of Chinese GDP at the sector's peak. Evergrande defaulted on over $300 billion in debt and was liquidated in 2024. Country Garden followed. Millions of Chinese households paid for apartments that will never be finished. Local governments that funded 40% of their revenue through land sales are facing fiscal crises as that revenue has collapsed. And banks holding loans against assets worth dramatically less than the loans written against them are carrying a burden not reflected in any official accounting. Chinese youth unemployment hit 21% before the government simply stopped publishing the data. That decision captures something essential about how this crisis is being managed. The political system has too much invested in the narrative of confident ascendancy to absorb the transparency that honest crisis management requires. Xi's officials have every incentive to present favorable numbers and no safety in presenting unfavorable ones. The result is a leader making decisions about the world's second-largest economy inside an information environment structurally designed to tell him what he wants to hear. That is not a recipe for accurate crisis diagnosis. It is a recipe for being the last person in the building to know it is on fire. Now look at America's banking system, because this is where the 2008 parallel is most precise and least discussed. Commercial real estate is in slow-motion collapse. Office vacancy rates above 20% in San Francisco, approaching that in Chicago, Dallas, and Houston. Remote work permanently destroyed a significant portion of office demand, and buildings valued on assumptions of high occupancy that no longer exist have fallen 30 to 40% from their peaks. The loans written against those buildings sit on the balance sheets of American regional banks. The FDIC estimated U.S. banks were carrying approximately $500 billion in unrealized losses on their securities portfolios at the end of 2023. $500 billion. Unrealized. Not yet triggered, not yet visible in the formal numbers, just sitting there, waiting. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in March 2023 when that kind of hidden loss became suddenly real. Second largest bank failure in American history. The official response was immediate. Isolated incident, unique circumstances, nothing systemic. Jerome Powell held a press conference, calm, calm, measured. The banking system, he said, was sound and resilient. He had strong incentives to say that, regardless of whether it was entirely true, because acknowledging systemic fragility risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. A bank run doesn't require insolvency. It only requires enough depositors to believe insolvency is possible. So the institutional bias is always toward reassurance. And the problem with always reassuring is that when it stops being accurate, the credibility needed to stabilize a genuine panic has already been spent. Now look at gold. Because gold is communicating something the official statements refuse to say. Gold broke through $3,000 per ounce in early 2025 and has continued climbing. Gold generates no income, pays no dividends. Rational investors in a stable, trustworthy financial system don't pile into gold. They pile into gold when they stop trusting the system, when they suspect the debt levels are so extreme that monetary debasement, inflation, depreciation, restructuring is not a risk but a near certainty. The biggest buyers right now are not panicking retail investors. They are central banks, Poland, China, India, Turkey, Singapore, all dramatically increasing gold reserves at the fastest pace since the 1960s. China added to its reserves every single month for over a year consecutively. These are the institutions that manage the global monetary system, the ones whose entire identity is invested in its credibility and stability, and they are quietly, systematically buying the one asset that exists specifically as insurance against that system's failure. When the people running the casino start buying escape routes, the guests should probably pay attention. And presiding over all of it is a leadership class almost perfectly structured to make the problem worse. In Washington, fiscal sustainability has ceased to exist as a serious political conversation. The national debt crossed $36 trillion with no meaningful response from either party. A tax package passed in 2025 that analysts estimate adds between $3 and $5 trillion more over 10 years. The bipartisan conversation about what it actually means to carry $36 trillion at $1 trillion in annual interest is not happening, because having it honestly is politically suicidal. In Beijing, a decade of consolidating power has eliminated the internal feedback mechanisms that might challenge Xi's economic assessments. Leaders who cannot acknowledge the true scale of their problems cannot solve them. In Brussels, the center is fragmenting in almost every major member state simultaneously. Germany's AfD came second nationally. France is paralyzed. Italy's government is skeptical of the very European institutions it would need in a crisis. The leadership structure required to coordinate a continental emergency response has become a political liability for the national leaders who would need to activate it. In Tokyo, the Bank of Japan raised rates in 2024 for the first time in 17 years. The unwinding that followed briefly shook global markets. A preview. With debt above 250% of GDP, Tokyo has no clean exit. Raise rates and crush debt servicing capacity. Keep them low and destroy the currency. The box has no door. Here is what we are actually looking at. $315 trillion in global debt at the highest sustained interest rates in 15 years. A Chinese property collapse still working through the global system. $500 billion in hidden losses on American bank balance sheets. A live military conflict, one escalation away from the most critical oil choke point on Earth. Gold at record highs as central banks quietly hedge against the system they publicly say is fine. And leadership across every major economy simultaneously at its most short-term focused, most politically constrained, and most structurally dishonest, at the precise moment that honesty and coordination are most urgently needed. In 2008, the crisis was caught. Barely, expensively, with enormous lasting damage, because the major powers could still function as partners when the stakes were high enough. That world does not exist anymore. The emergency tools have already been deployed. The debt levels that would need to be borrowed against in a crisis response are already at historic highs. The coordination mechanisms are politically broken. Some of the leaders wearing blindfolds in this story genuinely don't see it. Their incentive structures and information environments have narrowed their vision to the point where the systemic picture is not fully visible from where they sit. But some of them see it perfectly clearly, and they have made the calculation that the political cost of telling you the truth is higher than the cost of letting it become someone else's crisis. That is the blindfold that should make you angry. The data is there, the signals are there, the cliff is visible to anyone willing to look. And when this breaks, not if, when, The people who made that choice will be standing at a podium somewhere, looking appropriately grave, explaining to cameras why nobody could have seen it coming. They saw it coming. They just decided you didn't need to know.